everyone, and greetings from San Francisco, wherever you are. We're going to talk about health insurance reimbursement, incorrect misconceptions made by companies, is the title of our talk. My plan is to speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions. And if there are more questions, if we need more time for questions, I'd be glad to stay a few minutes afterwards. Let me just do this. For our agenda today, I've got 4 items. I'd just like to spend a few slides and talk about an overview as it relates to the webinar. And this has to do more with some resources I'd like to share with people. And I'd be remiss on our second item. I've got a couple of slides. I think it's important to understand why reimbursement is important for your customers. And particularly your company's commercial success. And once again, we're talking U.S., not outside the U.S. We'll move into a couple of misconceptions that are made by companies, and then we'll wrap up with a summary of key messages, followed by questions sent in through the chat. I first want to open up, I think this is really important. I've put this in intentionally to provide you with a consolidated list of resources that you could use for reimbursement planning. Obviously, we have today's webinar and the slides that will follow, but I want to bring your attention to these 3 items. That is a link to case studies that demonstrate the use of reimbursement and health insurance data to solve non-reimbursement issues. And that is to help solve FDA regulatory, clinical, sales, and marketing issues. And I encourage you to go in and understand how reimbursement and health insurance data can be used for market intelligence. Also, and once again, these links are taking you to our website. We have newsletters all the way back to 2004. And I think what I would do, I would skim through those, and in the process, I just clicked. In the process, look at the titles of these newsletters. And the reason I'm suggesting that is you will get a sense of the influence of health insurance payers outside of their reimbursement mandates. You will see health insurance payers demanding or requiring in order to be reimbursed from them to change operating procedures. So it's important to understand the influence of health insurance payers, not only within reimbursement, but outside of reimbursement. And then finally, this is a curated list of roughly about 2.5 dozen stakeholders who would be involved in determining your company's reimbursement pathway. So I really encourage everyone to do a deep dive into these 3. They'll be on the slides that will be sent to you after today's presentation. Definitions. You're going to hear me use 4 definitions over the next 40 minutes. You're going to hear me refer to what's called facility healthcare providers. These are healthcare, and in the United States, providers are broken into 2 categories, facility and professional. Facility providers, and you'll see, include the acute stay hospitals, hospital outpatient centers, physician offices, the ambulatory surgical centers, durable medical equipment suppliers. These are what I'll call is the infrastructure. It's the facility provider who purchases your product. It is the professional provider who uses your product. And this includes physician assistants, and other qualified healthcare providers such as therapists, nutritionists, and counselors. And you'll see why that's important a little bit later on. You're also going to hear me use a word or a term called primary procedure. Primary procedure is what we call the episode, the reason, the patient, what is happening to the patient. And the best way to describe primary procedures is to give you some examples. For example, I could be admitted to an outpatient center for a laparoscopic hysterectomy. I could be admitted to a hospital outpatient center for a orbital decompression surgical procedure. A telehealth visit with a physician to review facial skin issues is considered the primary. Spinal fusion is considered a primary. Adjunctive procedures improve the deployment of the primary procedure. So it's important to understand the difference between primary and adjunctive in this in our time today, and facility provider versus professional providers. Key messages that I really love everybody to take away is I want to increase your awareness of some of the common misconceptions made by companies, which often result in misinformed reimbursement plans. Provide you some resources to help you with your reimbursement planning efforts and avoid misconceptions. Increase your awareness to ask, we are designing this medical procedure. Has anyone thought how it would be reimbursed? And then finally, understand the importance of reimbursement as it relates to your facility and professional healthcare providers, operating revenue, and cash flow. So why is reimbursement important for your company's commercial success? Well, reimbursement is actually your customers' cash flow and operating margins. And let's look at this. This is a sources of operating revenue for Hospital Corporation of America. It's a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. They are the largest operator of hospitals in the United States. And this is a very good diagram to talk about why reimbursement is important for commercial success. So what we have here is we have fiscal year, and their year ends on the calendar year, December 31. And what we're looking at is revenues for 2024, 2023, and 2022. So in 2024, HCA, Hospital Corporation of America, made over $70.6 billion. In 2023, they made $64.9 billion. And in 2022, $60.2 billion. Well, how is this money made? This money is made through reimbursement. That is, if we look over here on the left-hand side of my left, I hope it's your left, we have what's called a payer mix. And if we look at the Medicare payer mix of Medicare and managed Medicare, you're looking at reimbursements from Medicare in 2024 of roughly about $24 billion. If we look at Medicaid, the two line items for Medicaid, once again, in this payer mix, you're looking at, from Medicaid, $10 billion. If we look at private insurance or commercial insurance could be reimbursement from Humana, Cigna, Aetna, and even private insurance such as companies like Google, Google employees that were treated at HCA hospitals. That's almost that's 34.9 billion. So what happens is reimbursement is, as it says up here, is your customer's cash flow and operating margins. This is how they make money. This is simply how they make money, is reimbursement for purchasing and using your medical procedure that you are developing. So now I'm just going to go, I've just talked about why reimbursement is important. I think it's just, again, everybody understand that it is cash flow and operating margins, or you can look at it and say, this is how my customers make money. Now I'm going to spend the rest of our time talking about a couple of common reimbursement misconceptions that are made by companies and do result in misinformed plans. The first one I'd like to speak about is the following, and we hear this. The company Rowinski Group has been in business for 21 years, and we work with companies from around the world. And we have worked with over 250 companies. So we hear a lot. And one of the misconceptions we hear a lot is the following. My company's procedure reduces hospital length of stay and operating room time versus the standard of care, and as a result, should be reimbursed at a higher amount relative to the standard of care. So once again, I'm reducing time, the hospital stay as well as the OR stay, and should be reimbursed more. Well, let's take a dive into that. What reimbursement is it's reimbursing the costs that your customers have incurred for purchasing and using your procedure. So if we look at facility providers, they expect to be reimbursed to cover their costs. Well, what are their costs for purchasing and using your procedure? Time for labor, costs. So we have cost time, we have costs for outfitting and supplying physical and virtual medical spaces. And when we say outfitting and supplying, that's utilities, waste management, connectivity. We have costs for purchasing capital equipment, medical grade video and audio telecommunication systems, medication, software licensing, renewals. That is, facility providers incur what we call infrastructure costs and purchase your procedure or your technology. And as a result, expect to be reimbursed for purchasing and using your technology because they have incurred these costs. If we look at the professional provider, that is, these are the physicians, the PAs, counselors, dietitians, they expect to be reimbursed to cover their costs associated with using your primary or adjunctive procedure. So the facility provider is purchasing, but it's the professional provider who is using and expects to be reimbursed for their costs. Well, what are their costs? Their costs is the time that they have logged in, or the time that they have incurred for the procedure or the visit that was associated with using your procedure. Some procedures are very complex, and as a result, skill and effort for the procedure is reimbursed. And when we say skill and effort, if I'm a cardiologist and I read an ECG, that's roughly about, and that's a low skill, important but low skill, low complexity, that's roughly about $10 to $20 for that read. Now, if I contrast that with an aortic valve replacement, which could take 2 to 3 hours and very complex and requires a fair amount of skill, that's reimbursed anywhere between $3,000 and $6,000. So once again, complexity also plays into that, as well as practice expenses. An important practice expense that they expect to be reimbursed for purchasing and using your procedure is malpractice insurance premiums. So once again, reimbursement is, while it's your customers, your facility and your professional providers operating revenue, it is at the end of the day covering costs. So if we go look at this schematic here, this is you in the middle, and you have professional healthcare providers and your facility healthcare providers. And once again, they've purchased and used your product with the expectation of submitting claims back to the patient's payer. And those claims are the costs that they have incurred and expect to be reimbursed for purchasing and using your procedure. So let's look at this in terms of going back to this misconception. And that is, the misconception is I'm reducing length of stay and operating time, therefore I should be reimbursed more. That is not the case. Actually, it would result in reduced reimbursement amounts because I am reducing time, both for the facility as well as the physician. Again, time is a cost, but if I'm decreasing time, I should be paid less. And that's important to understand. If I'm increasing time, um, it should be reimbursed more. Is big picture, once again, looking at these costs and how you affect these costs um, will will determine the amount that is ultimately paid. Here's another common reimbursement misconception made by companies we hear a lot of. My company procedure has codes and is reimbursed. And I'd like to say that that is not the case, and I'd like to make the case why that is in the next several slides. I'd like to talk about two decisions that health insurance payers make that will affect your reimbursement plan and options. And the two decisions we're going to talk about is the creation and, and the modification of coverage policies and reimbursement methodologies. So once again, these are two decisions that health insurance payers make that are not related to coding, and but yet will trump coding in the whole scheme of reimbursement. Coding is one element, but I would argue these two elements, coverage policies and reimbursement methodologies, play a much bigger role in determining if your procedure is reimbursed or not, despite everyone having codes. So let's look a little bit at the coverage policy. A negative coverage policy is the number one reason why both the primary and the adjunctive procedures are not reimbursed. It is not coding. And in the next slide, we're going to look at a negative coverage policy. And this policy actually put a company out of business, one of our companies out of business. Health insurance payers are constantly amending their current and creating new coverage policies for the primary procedure. And that's important to understand, that it is the reason these coverage policies exist is for the primary procedure, not the adjunctive. However, what's important for adjunctive technologies or procedures to understand is that amending or creating the primary procedure of which you are facilitating will affect you, will affect you. And thus it's important as an adjunct to understand any changes to your primary procedures coverage policies. And finally, why do health insurance payers create or amend coverage policies for their primary procedure? Well, payers want to establish new policies for emerging primary procedures and modify current policies for existing primary procedures. And what we're going to look at two examples. This is a modification to an existing primary procedure coverage policy, and then we'll look at a new policy. So, and I'm throughout the presentation, I'll make a reference to Medicare. Medicare is the largest payer in the country, if not the world, and has a tremendous an influence not only within its plan, but also on the commercial side as well. And it's also just much faster for me to kind of, because we don't have a lot of time to just reference Medicare, and but it does, like I said, the other payers do emulate what Medicare does. So the reason I'm showing this, and this is, I think, a good demonstration on how reimbursement was changed due to coverage policy and not coding. But this was, in this policy, it was a conversion from a positive to a negative coverage policy through the inclusion of national frequency limits. We'll talk about that. And to understand that this change had a negative impact on this particular company's commercialization success. In fact, it closed the company up. And we're going to be looking at And Teresa, I just need to understand, can you see my slide? I just changed slides. Hold up,
Yeah, a
everyone.
PDF came up.
Okay, PDF did come up and it says
Mhm.
you can see pelvic floor dysfunction, anorectal manometry.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, super. Thank you. Um, okay, so this was one of our companies who was developing a point of care test for anorectal manometry. Now, anorectal manometry is the gold standard diagnostic to determine fecal incontinence. And and the way it is currently done is it is a hospital-based test. So one has to go to the hospital, and it's not only for the patient, but the test is very expensive. The hospital has to maintain staff to operate the equipment, obviously maintain the equipment, and when necessary, replace the equipment. Um, so our company, one of our company clients had developed a point of care test to determine, to diagnose fecal incontinence. And this point of care test could be used in the physician office. So it's a fraction of the price of the hospital-based test and doesn't require the patient to go to a hospital, but they could go to a physician office. And so that's a real game changer. And what had happened in the course of them developing their point of care test for to determine or to diagnose fecal incontinence, Medicare made a change that was national. And what Medicare did is they said in their national coverage policy, which has to be followed throughout the country, is Medicare does not expect any anorectal manometry test to be billed more than twice in a patient's lifetime. So we went from unlimited use of the anorectal manometry test to twice in a patient's lifetime. And I don't know if there's very many companies. Our company could not determine, they could not figure out how to survive as a company with this type of usage or utilization within the Medicare population. And Medicare is a very important payer for them. Um, but we went from unlimited to twice in a patient's lifetime and had essentially not only impacted the hospital-based um, anal, anorectal manometry tests or diagnostic tests, but also their point of care. And once again, being point of care, one of the ways to survive is having many uses throughout a patient's lifetime and materially less expensive as well than the hospital-based. So this is an example of a positive coverage policy going to a negative. Um, and here's the creation of a new primary procedure coverage policy. And this was done by Medicare back when carotid stents came out. I use this because it was one of the cleanest policies we have ever read. A lot of these policies, by the way, everyone, are roughly anywhere between 20 to 50 pages and contain a lot of historical data that you have to read as well. Um, but this was really well written by Medicare, and I use it to make a point here regarding creation of a new coverage policy for once again the primary procedure. Now, the primary procedure is carotid stenting, and here's a very high level summary of Medicare's coverage decision for carotid stenting procedure to reimburse the carotid stenting facility. So once again, this is our facility and the physician who is our professional healthcare provider. And it would only be done under the following conditions. A Medicare beneficiary is enrolled in an FDA-approved Category B IDE study or a large mandated FDA post-approval study. Or the beneficiary is considered high risk for carotid endarterectomy and has symptomatic carotid arterial stenosis greater than 70%. And must be performed in a Medicare-approved carotid stenting facility. So when this policy came out, I cannot tell you how many companies who were selling carotid stents into a non-approved Medicare carotid stenting facility. And what that means is both the physician as well as the carotid stenting facility or facility provider, if they were not approved, would not be reimbursed by Medicare. So you can look at coverage policies as the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Like you do in FDA trials, there's inclusion and exclusion criteria. But look at coverage policies as the inclusion exclusion criteria to determine, in this case, if Medicare is going to reimburse the carotid stenting facility and the physician for the costs that they have incurred for purchasing and using, in this case, carotid stents. The second reason that that is the second reason that a procedure is not reimbursed has to do with capitated reimbursement methodologies. We're going to talk about, we have a couple of examples here. I see I'm doing well on time. We're going to talk about a couple of examples here, but these capitated reimbursement methodologies are created by the payers, the health insurance payers, to manage costs and quality related to the primary procedure. So you could see a lot of these payer decisions, these health insurance payer decisions, are made within relevant to the primary procedure. And thus, if you're adjunct, it's real important to understand what is the primary procedure and to follow it. Capitated reimbursement methods is another reason, besides coverage policy, there is no reimbursement for an adjunctive procedure and possibly the primary. It is not coding. Once again, reimbursement, you could have billing codes in place, and you'll see if the reimbursement methodology may not allow those codes to be reimbursed. And we're going to look at a couple examples of when that happens. And we're going to look at two examples. We're going to look at a Medicare system. Actually, this is the first capitated payment methodology system that was put in place all the way back in 1984 by Medicare. It is called the Medicare Severity Diagnostic Related Groups. You might have heard something called MSDRG. MSDRGs are not codes. It is a reimbursement capitated. When we say capitated, you'll see it is a lump sum payment methodology. When we look at reimbursement methodologies, and we say that, that's a fancy word to say, how does the payer, health insurance payer, reimburse the facility, the provider, and the professional provider for the costs that they have incurred for purchasing and using your medical procedure? And big picture, to give you a sense of that, on one line, on one end of the spectrum, is what we refer to as line item reimbursement methodology, where every supply, every adjunct procedure, supplies, drugs, adjunct procedures that were used during the primary procedure are reimbursed. On the other end of the spectrum, we have capitated reimbursement methodologies, where everything, supplies, drugs, the adjunct procedures, labor, all of that, all those costs we talked about earlier, is reimbursed in one lump sum. So capitated, you might hear it referred to as lump sum. You also might hear it referred to as bundled payment methodologies or bundled payment methods. So that's important to understand methodologies, because those are determined by the health insurance payer. And if we look at the first one that was put into place all the way back in 1994, the MSDRG system, it reimburses hospitals and we're talking once again the facility provider, hospitals, a capitated or lump sum amount for all the procedures performed, supplies and products used, labor and infrastructure that were provided to that Medicare beneficiary during their hospital stay. So, and the hospital stay is from the time of admission to the time of discharge. One sum that is based on the primary procedure. Everything is paid. One sum versus line item. So let's look at this example. We have a Medicare beneficiary, a female, 70 years of age, admitted for coronary arterial disease and no major complications or comorbidities. And she's going to get a stent, and all the work for that stent that is being done at that hospital, we'll call it Hospital A, falls under MSDRG 247, which then assigns for that hospital based on its geographic location a little bit over $11,000. However, the interventional cardiologist who is doing the stent, who is doing the procedure, she decides to have a general surgeon implant a wireless GI monitoring device for roughly about $1,200 because she, the cardiologist, is concerned about early sepsis onset. Well, this $1,200, once again, that is going to get bundled into that $11,000. There is no additional costs for using this adjunct technology. For using the adjunct technology. So what happens is whatever operating margin you had, the hospital had on this $11,000 is probably negated and now possibly negative because of the use of this monitoring device to detect early sepsis. This is how capitated systems work. Let's look at another system, what's called the Medicare Advantage. And this is an annual capitated payment methodology. And what that means is the way Medicare Advantage works, it is a Medicare plan offered by the private insurance companies to Medicare beneficiaries. And in Medicare, you have traditional Medicare and you have Medicare Advantage. Medicare Advantage is run by commercial insurance companies, once again, marketing these plans to Medicare beneficiaries. And roughly now, and it was introduced by Congress in early 1990s, and roughly now 50% of all Medicare beneficiaries are under what we call the Advantage plans, and 50% are under the traditional plans. But in the Advantage plans, what happens is, big picture, Medicare pays, and let's say we have Humana. Humana is a big player in offering Medicare Advantage plans throughout the country. This is how they make a living. Insurance companies sell plans to you and I, and to businesses and to unions. But this is how they make their money. They sell plans, and in this case, in Medicare Advantage plans that they sell, is Medicare will pay, in this case, Humana, a lump sum, one sum, that would cover all primary, all adjunctive procedures, all visits for 1 calendar year. So in this case, if we look at this payment method, it is annual and affects all primary, all adjunctive procedures. If we compare it to the MSDRG system, which impacts, this is not an Advantage capitated system. It falls under what we call the traditional Medicare reimbursement plans. This is just limited to the hospital stay. So it's the primary procedure that's being reimbursed from the time, and all the costs from the time that patient enters the hospital until they are discharged. So these are two reasons. If we look at, going back to everyone, these are two reasons why your product is, why your procedure may not be reimbursed. Coverage policies and reimbursement methodologies will trump coding in 99% of all instances. So as we wrap up here, once again, going back and looking at the messages from today, I hope in the short time that we have had together, I've increased your awareness of some of the common, very common misconceptions made by companies. And because of these misconceptions, misinform companies as relates to their reimbursement planning. Early on, I provided you some resources to help you with your planning and hopefully avoid at least these two misconceptions that we have shared. In terms of the third key message here, I hope all of you are developing medical procedures. And in the process of developing medical procedures, someone asks, how is it going to be reimbursed? And then finally, the importance of reimbursement. What is reimbursement? It is reimbursing or paying back the costs that your customers, your facility, healthcare provider customer for purchasing your procedure and the costs that they have incurred, and your professional healthcare provider, the doctor, the therapist, for purchasing and using your procedure. But it is a reimbursement of those costs. And the reimbursement or those dollar amounts, which can, as we saw through HCA, Hospital Corporation of America, is in the tens of billions of dollars. But it is your customers' operating revenue and cash flow. And that's the importance of it. Okay, super. We've got here some time for questions. I'd be glad to go back to any of the slides. If necessary, just put that in the chat. But we've got about 15 minutes. If we have more questions, I'd be glad to stay a little bit extra time.
So it looks like there's a question. I wonder, how does the reimbursement work for medical durable equipment?
Yeah, so that's a DME is a type of facility customer. Is and the DMEs suppliers, they have to be certified, in this case by Medicare or whatever plan they are for a DME. But they would also, the misconceptions we talked about here, durable medical equipment is equipment that is typically, let's talk about what it is, big picture. It is typically used in the patient's home, and it is reusable and typically used anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So this is medical supplies that have been prescribed by a physician or a qualified healthcare professional to be used by the patient in their home. Wheelchairs come to my mind is one of those types of examples. And so that, we're not necessarily diving into reimbursement mechanisms. What we are diving into is misconceptions of that, and these misconceptions cause, whether you are developing a DME or a DME procedure or product, or you're developing a primary or adjunctive procedure to be used in an ambulatory surgical center. What we've talked about today is still relevant. That is, if a DME is reducing time, or if a DME is expensive, let's go back and let's talk about costs. Okay, so let's look at DME, durable medical equipment, are considered facility providers. And let's say they have a wheelchair, I'm just going to use a wheelchair, that is exceedingly expensive. It could be 3 to 4 times more expensive than a standard wheelchair. So that DME provider, oops, sorry everyone. Here you are selling your very high-end wheelchair to a DME provider, they will expect to be reimbursed from that patient's payer. But if that DME wheelchair, that high-end DME, that high-end wheelchair is covered, we have coverage policies in place. We have a reimbursement methodology that permits it not to be bundled or capitated. It's got coding. Then it would be reimbursed and over time, eventually at a higher rate, because it does cost the supplier, who is a type of facility provider, more money to carry that product and to dispense it to the patient. Next. Yep.
I have a question. Hi, Susan. Nice to meet you. Thank you so much. I have very little knowledge on reimbursement, but I just was thinking about the general kind of scheme of med tech. I totally understand in terms of decreasing length of stay, that would decrease the amount of reimbursement a facility would be able to ask for from payers, and everyone's trying to keep their bottom line low. Is there concern that sometimes this leads to less innovation within med tech?
No,
No. Okay.
no,
Because I'm
no.
thinking,
No, it's a good question, Susan. It's a good question. And I'll share with you that. Are you with Mittel?
yes.
Okay. I know the folks that run that company. So actually, we'll be doing a webinar together in September.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yep. So, and it's going to be it will be using reimbursement data for FDA planning purposes. So no, there isn't. The reality is the trend in any type of technology market is towards reduction of costs. Now, and we have procedures that are reducing costs. Likewise, and it's a very dynamic market. You have costs where it's a new procedure. New procedures are typically more expensive if they are covered, and the reimbursement methodology allows them not to be capitated.
Mhm.
So, you've got that fluidity of new procedures maturing, and in the process of maturing, they get more efficient. And because they are getting more efficient, they are reducing costs, in this case, of a primary procedure. And
Right.
that's offset with new primary procedures that come in that are costing more. So it's a very dynamic environment. But no, there's no shortage of taking a primary and making it more efficient. And no, it has not. And you can see, you can look at the technology, the procedures that are currently available now. And
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Just looking at the numbers you put for, the length of stay is decreased, then you're going to be reimbursed less. I didn't know if companies were like, well, then I'm not going to put an expensive new innovation that's going to be better for patients because I'm not going to get paid as much. But I see what you're saying. It's dynamic and
It's dynamic, and but we're talking about what is reimbursement. It's reimbursing, customers, healthcare provider customers for their costs.
Mhm.
And if my costs, are going down, um, so does eventually the reimbursement amount.
Sure. That makes
Right.
sense.
Yep. A good question. Thank you. We do hear that too.
Yeah, just coming from the side of, innovative new technologies, and I'm trying to figure out kind of how to speak to clients about it's still, worth it to innovate and,
Oh,
put
yeah,
together
absolutely.
these devices. There is light at the end of the reimbursement tunnel because it's very scary, I think, for new medical device companies to be looking down the line at reimbursement and how that's all going to work for them. So,
Right. Right. And if they don't do it, somebody else will.
yeah,
And we've seen that as well. So,
awesome. Thank you.
okay. Other questions?
Hi, Susan. Thanks for the very informative info session. I was just curious if you've had any experience with FDA's early payer feedback program, if you've had kind of any exposure to that program and what your thoughts are on the utility of it and for what products it might be useful.
Sure. Yeah. No, we've worked with companies to prepare them for that meeting. And just let's kind of maybe just I'll just briefly describe what it's about. It is a program that was launched by FDA, gosh, believe it or not, back in 2016, because I remember it because we commented on it when it was presented. And what it's there for is to facilitate early, particularly in the pre-sub meeting phase, a discussion between not only FDA, but a payer can be invited into your pre-sub meetings so you can start to get a sense of coverage. And it's primarily, by the way, focused on coverage. Going back to, I talked about two big decisions that payers make, coverage and reimbursement methodologies. This this discussion that is facilitated through the FDA and is carried out during pre-sub meetings, typically one or two. If you get two with a payer, you're really lucky, your payer. But it's there to inform you on what data you may need. It's non-binding. I will share with you the advice is non-binding. They will share back some of their feedback if you're fortunate. The payer, is on your pre-sub meeting and is providing you feedback on data that they look for coverage policy decisions. And this is because you could potentially collect data for coverage policy decisions during your FDA mandated trials. So the way it works is in terms of a practical perspective. So once again, it's done for coverage policies. And the company makes an invitation to a payer of interest. If I have a product that might be for pediatrics, I'm probably going to be working in the commercial market, possibly Medicaid, the commercial insurance market. Let me just see here. I just want to, no. Let me just go. Yeah. I had to skip over this, but let's say I'm working with, I'm in the pediatric market. I could be in here in Medicaid, which is insurance for the poor and working poor. I will share with everyone roughly about half the kids in the United States are covered under Medicaid. And then we have the commercial market. But what you literally do is extend an invitation to a payer or payer representative through the FDA. The FDA kind of facilitates the discussion, but they make no, they're not involved in any of the decision making. They are just facilitators to invite them to sit in on a meeting or two. If you get a meeting, you're really lucky. If you get two meetings with your invited payer, you're really lucky. But really, they're there to provide you non-binding, high-level guidance as it relates to coverage data that they like to see or that is amenable to them for a pediatric product. And that's really important. It's kind of high-level guidance because the last thing you want to do is go through an FDA trial, collect data, and find out that it's not data that, in this case, Medicaid or the commercial payers would use. So that's big picture how it works. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was curious do you see particular types of products that benefit most from seeking out this kind of input, or is it something that you see less often?
Well, the way to answer that is that if a procedure has coverage issues, when these invitations are made, I want to share with you, it's not like a single, it is actually a dossier. And in this dossier, we spell out very clearly why we're reaching out to United Healthcare, because it's coverage. That's the reason. It's not the technology. It is based on our research, Company A's research. We have coverage issues. We currently have a negative coverage policy. We don't have a coverage policy in place. And we would like to, and here is, in these dossiers, here is what we found, and here are our conclusions. I mean, you have one bite at this apple, so you got to really you got to really make sure you are making it clear to the payer you're inviting. You have a full grasp of the coverage landscape and the issues that you want to have solved, and you're seeking their guidance on it. So it's if if a procedure has coverage issues, then this could be a program. For a company to use. If a procedure has coding issues, you're not going to be here. Does that help?
Got it. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
It's coverage. Any more questions?
I have another question
Sure.
related to, you mentioned that, for instance, we were talking about Medicare coverage decisions are always being amended or added. And sometimes a company can be moving forward with their procedure, but then it's amended and suddenly the company is no longer able to maintain, operations for this reason. Is there anything you can do if there's been a change to Medicare, or that's just kind of, the final decision is, the physicians that, in that office of the government have decided that this is what's going to be covered and this isn't, and the inclusion exclusion that you were talking about. Is there anything that can be done?
Yeah. One of the things we do is we do monitoring. Whoever we call them beachhead payers, everyone. And our beachhead payer for today, by the way, was Medicare. But we will monitor Medicare's decision making. If they're going to change it, there's a process. If they are going to be changing, amending, or creating new coverage policies, there's a public process for that.
Okay.
And it's through so we monitor announcements from Medicare of changes that they are going to make. And there is comment period before that is done. So Medicare is very transparent, though kludgy. I'm going to say kludgy would be a good word I would use, but they're very transparent, and they do seriously take in input from the stakeholders. Stakeholders could include physician groups, hospital association, patient advocacy groups, companies, and they'll take in that input in terms of determining whether they move forward with their recommendation to modify or create a new coverage policy, and if so, in what capacity. So that's how I will share with you. It's the commercial insurance companies that are really the most challenging to work with. Medicare is a public. It's a government plan, so you've got that level of transparency. And Medicare does a very good job in announcing. There's a formal process in terms of when they make these announcements. Where on the commercial side, the Humanas, the Kaiser Permanentes, they're privately held companies, and they do not make these decisions apparent. They're done, and they can be done internally. They don't have to post decision making.